Ladies and gentlemen, this is Abdullah from Freedom for All. Welcome to another episode of Weekly Nugget series. On this episode, I would try to talk about one of the most important things in conscious manifestation journey, and I would also discuss why people, especially with Neville's teachings, often fail to progress. So the quote is, one must adopt either the way of imagination or the way of sense. No compromise or neutrality is possible. So here, he talks about physical senses and imagination and asks to select any one between these two. Senses involve basically smell, sight, taste, touch, and sound, whereas imagination is something not perceivable with any of these five physical senses. In order to use your imagination, it is important to pay full attention to imagined end and take full attention away from what the physical senses reveal. By the way, there is a video on attention linked here that talks about both senses and attention in details. As I was with the quote, by adopting any one between the way of sense and the way of imagination means to select any one way while living psychologically. Psychological well-being is the most important thing in life because where you live psychologically, you move physically. So for your psychological well-being, you can either live with the senses or imagined end. Now, what happens if you live with the senses? All the reactions of your life depend on what you are seeing in the outer visible world, which means you react well if you see something your judgmental mind likes, and you react bad if you see the opposite. Actions and reactions of your life fully depend on the visible facts here. Conversely, what happens when you live in the way of your own imagination? It's quite fascinating because when you fully live in the way of your imagination, you won't bother about any sign that your visible world shows. I know this is not something many of you are programmed to do, but with a little practice, you can definitely master this. However, adopting the way of imagining does not mean if something hits you in the body so bad, you can't feel bad after that. It means going back to the desired end by occupying the desired state after you react to something you found hard to accept. Let's try to figure out some common mistakes many people from Neville's communities go through. They often decide to adopt the way of imagining but end up living with the senses without going back to the decision they made earlier. Quite often people say that they're adopting the way of imagining but not doing the inner work and reacting bad when something happens without going back to the way of imagining. Besides, people sometimes are confused on taking actions thinking they're consciously working on imagination while they're not. Furthermore, they detach from the visible world without attaching themselves to the imagined world. These are not good practices. Everyone should work on their imagination at least as much as they do work on their senses. Now I'll try to discuss what are required to deal with such difficulties. First of all, adopting the way of imagining does not mean not being physically present in the outer world. You can mentally ignore the outer world, but physically you cannot get rid of it. So instead of judging the world outside, observe your reactions and see if you need any change in your mental diet. Secondly, do not compromise with your imagined end just because your senses are not revealing anything desirable. On this very quote, Neville said, no compromise or neutrality is possible between the way of senses and the way of imagining. So do not minimize the end because of anything external. Thirdly, if you have actions to take, just take them confidently. Confident actions does not mean you have to follow your judgmental mind while taking the actions. Just be confident without using your rational mind. Moreover, when you detach from the 3D world, make sure you attach yourself to the 4D world or the world of imagination. Lastly, if you cannot adopt the way of imagining at the moment, choose the way of senses temporarily. Don't fight yourself with it. I am telling you this because I think one of the hardest things in life is to force self to do something that the ego is not allowing to do. That's the inner battle in life in spiritual meaning. So don't use your mind to fight your ego. Instead, temporarily go with the way of senses, knowing you would adopt the way of imagining sooner or later. Because I really believe, even if you go with the way of senses today, you must be able to adopt the way of imagining tomorrow. Sometimes darkness can show you light. So that was the nugget for this week. Feel free to post your question if you have any. I will see you next week. Bye-bye.